Chapter 1. Concerning the birthplace, family, and name of the Admiral Christopher Columbus. Two things which are important to know about every famous man are his birthplace and family, because men generally accord more honor to those who were born in great cities and of noble parents. Therefore some wish me to tell how the Admiral came of illustrious stock, although misfortune had reduced his parents to great poverty and need, and how they descended from that Colonus of whom Cornelius Tacitus tells us in the 12th book of his work, saying that he brought King Mithridates a prisoner to Rome, for which exploit the Roman people awarded Colonus the consular dignities, the honor of bearing the standard and the place among the tribunes. They also wish me to make a great story of those two illustrious Coloni, his relatives, of whom Sabelle Lecuse tells that they won a great victory over the Venetians. But I have spared myself such labor, believing that the Admiral was chosen for his great work by our Lord, who desired him as his true apostle to follow the examples of others of his elect by publishing his name on distant seas and shores, not in cities and palaces, thereby imitating our Lord himself, who though his descent was from the blood royal of Jerusalem, yet was content to have his parentage from an obscure source. Similarly, the Admiral, although endowed with all the qualities that his great task required, chose to leave in obscurity all that related to his birthplace and family. Therefore some who wish to dim his fame say that he was from Nervi, others from Sugirio, and still others from Bugiasco, all of which are little places near Genoa and situated on the same coast. Others, who would add to his dignity, say that he was from Savona, and still others that he was Genoese. Those who go farthest afield assign him to Piacenza, in which city there are some persons of worth of his family, and tombs with arms and epitaphs bearing the name Colombo, because this was really the name of his ancestors. But he changed the name to make it conform to the language of the country in which he came to reside and raise a new estate, as well as to make it agree with the ancient one and distinguish those who descended from him from all collateral descendants. That is why he called himself Colon. Reflecting on this, I was moved to believe that just as most of his affairs were directed by a secret providence, so the variety of his name and surname was not without its mystery. We could cite as examples many names which a hidden cause assigned as symbols of the parts which their bearers were to play. Just so, the Admiral's name foretold the novel and wonderful deed he was to perform. If we consider the common surname of his forebears, we may say that he was truly Columbus, or Dove, because he carried the grace of the Holy Ghost to that new world which he discovered, showing those people who knew him, not who was God's beloved Son, as the Holy Ghost did in the figure of a dove when St. John baptized Christ, and because over the waters of the ocean, like the dove of Noah's ark, he bore the olive branch and oil of baptism to signify that those people who had been shut up in the ark of darkness and confusion were to enjoy peace and union with the church. So the surname of Cologne, which he revived, was a fitting one, because in Greek it means member, and by his proper name Christopher, men might know that he was a member of Christ, by whom he was sent for the salvation of those people. And if we give his name its Latin form, which is Christophorus Colonus, we may say that just as St. Christopher is reported to have gotten that name because he carried Christ over deep waters with great danger to himself, and just as he conveyed over people whom no other could have carried, so the Admiral Christophorus Colonus, asking Christ's aid and protection in that perilous path, crossed over with his company that the Indian nations might become dwellers in the triumphant church of heaven. There is reason to believe that many souls that Satan expected to catch because they had not passed through the waters of baptism were by the Admiral made dwellers in the eternal glory of paradise. Chapter 2 of the Admiral's parents and their condition, and of the false account that one Justiniani gives of his occupation before he acquired the title of Admiral. Leaving now the etymology or derivation and meaning of the name of the Admiral, and turning to the condition of his parents, I say that they were persons of worth who had been reduced to poverty by the wars and factions of Lombardy. I have not been able to find how or where they lived, although the Admiral himself says in a letter that he and his ancestors always followed the sea. To inform myself better on this point, in passing through Sugurio, I tried to learn what I could from two brothers of the name of Colombo, who were the richest men of that place and were said to be related to the admiral in some way. But as the younger of the two was more than 100 years old, I could learn nothing. I do not think that we in whose veins flows his blood should feel less proud on that account, for I think it better that all our glory should come from himself than that we should go about inquiring if his father was a merchant or went hunting with falcons. Of such men there are thousands, everywhere, and 3 days after their death the memory of them is lost, without a trace among their own townspeople and relations. I believe that such fame and nobility lend less luster than the glory that comes to me from a father, whose illustrious deeds had no need of ancestral riches, which, like poverty, are the fruit not of virtue, but of fortune. Certainly, taking into account his renown and valor, the writers who treat of his occupation should not have described him as one who practiced the mechanical arts. That, however, some have done, basing themselves on what one Agostino Giustiniani wrote in his chronicle. I shall not attempt to refute this by seeking testimony to the contrary, since in a matter of which living men have no recollection, the words of Giustiniani no more constitute proof than it would be proof if I said that I had heard the contrary from 1,000 persons. Nor shall I try to show it to be false by citing the histories of others who have written about Don Christopher, but rather I shall refute it with the writings and testimony of Giustiniani himself, in whom is verified the proverb that says, Mandesem apportet esse memorem. The liar should have a long memory, else he will contradict what he has said before. That is what Giustiniani did in this case, writing in his edition of the Psalter in 4 languages, and a gloss on the verse in omnem terram exhibit sonis eorum. This Christopher Columbus, having learned the rudiments of letters as a child, on reaching manhood devoted himself to the art of navigation and went to Lisbon in Portugal, where he learned geography, which a brother of his, who was a mapmaker there, taught him. As a result of this, of his conversations with men who used to go to the Portuguese fortress of São Jorge da Minha in Africa, and of what he had read in the writings of geographers, he conceived the idea of going to the lands that he later discovered. These words make it plain that he practiced no manual or mechanical art, since the author writes that he spent his childhood learning letters, his young manhood in navigation, and his later years in discovery. Thus, Giustiniani convicts himself of being a false historian, and an inconsiderate, prejudiced, and malicious compatriot. Surely, in speaking of a distinguished man and one who so greatly honored the country, whose history Giustiniani wrote, even had the admiral's parents been humble folk, it would have been more honorable for Giustiniani to speak of his family as other writers do, saying, Humili loco, seu e parentibus paperimus ortus. Rather than use such offensive words as he applied in the said Psalter, falsely calling Columbus an artisan. Even if Giustiniani had not contradicted himself, common sense tells us that a man occupied in some manual art or trade would need to be reared and grow old in it to learn it to perfection, and could not have wandered from youth through so many lands or learned so many languages and sciences as his writings show, especially the 4 principal sciences that his work required: astronomy, geography, geometry, and navigation. But it is no wonder that Giustiniani dares lie about a matter of which little is known, since in narrating very simple and familiar things having to do with the admiral's discovery and navigation, he managed to tell more than 12 falsehoods on half a page of his Psalter. In order not to break the thread of my story, I shall mention them only briefly, since in the course of this book, and with the writings of others, I shall prove what he said to be false. The first lie is that the admiral went to Lisbon to learn geography from a brother who lived there. The truth is just the opposite, for he had lived before in that city and taught his brother all he knew. The second falsehood is that as soon as he came to Castile, the Catholic sovereigns Ferdinand and Isabella accepted his proposals after all others had rejected them. The truth is that these princes accepted his proposals after 7 years. The third falsehood is that he sailed on his voyage of discovery with 2 ships, which is not true, since he departed with 3 caravels. The fourth falsehood is that the first island he discovered was Hispaniola. In reality, it was Guanahani, which the admiral named San Salvador. The fifth falsehood is that the aforesaid island of Hispaniola was inhabited by cannibals, men who eat human flesh. In reality, he found its inhabitants to be the best and most civilized people in those parts. The sixth falsehood is that he took and battled the first Indian canoe or boat that he found. On the contrary, it will be seen that on that first voyage he warred against no Indians, but kept peace and friendship with them to the day of his departure from Hispaniola. The seventh falsehood is that he returned by way of the Canary Islands, which were not on the return route of those ships. The eighth falsehood is that from those islands he dispatched a messenger to the most serene sovereigns aforesaid. The fact is that he did not touch there, as said above, and he himself was his own messenger. The ninth falsehood is that on his second voyage he sailed with 12 ships, for it is plain there were 17. The 10th lie is that he arrived at Hispaniola in 20 days, which is too short a time to come even to the first islands. He actually did not reach Hispaniola for 2 months, arriving much earlier at the others. The 11th lie is that he disembarked on Hispaniola with 2 ships, for it is known that he took 3 ships when he sailed for Cuba from Hispaniola. Giustiniani's 12th falsehood is that Hispaniola is 4 hours distant from Spain, since the admiral calculates the distance to be more than 5. To add a 13th lie, he says that the western end of Cuba is 6 hours distant from Hispaniola, thus making the distance between Hispaniola and Cuba greater than that between Spain and Hispaniola. Considering then what little care he took to learn and write about the truth about such simple matters, one may judge how well he informed himself about so obscure a point as Columbus's occupation, BK, and one concerning which he contradicts himself, as has been shown. Ending this digression, which I fear has already wearied my readers, I shall only say that because of the many errors and falsehoods contained in the said history and the Psalter of Giustiniani, the Signory of Genoa, considering the lying character of his writings, has provided penalties for whoever possesses or reads his history, and has ordered that great diligence be shown in searching for copies in all places to which they may have been sent, so that they may be destroyed by public decree. I return to my principal theme and conclude by saying that the admiral was a learned man of great experience, and did not waste his time in manual or mechanical labor, which did not comport with the grandeur and immortality of the wonderful deeds he was to perform. And I shall end this chapter with some words taken from his letter to the nurse of the Prince Don Juan of Castile. I am not the first admiral of my family. Let them call me, then, by what name they will. For after all, David, that wisest of kings, tended sheep, and was later made king of Jerusalem. And I am the servant of him who raised David to that high estate. Chapter 3. Of the bodily disposition of the admiral, and of the sciences that he learned. The admiral was a well-built man of more than average stature, the face long, the cheeks somewhat high, his body neither fat nor lean. He had an aquiline nose and light-colored eyes. His complexion, too, was light and tending to bright red. In youth, his hair was blonde, but when he reached the age of 30, it all turned white. In eating and drinking, and in the adornment of his person, he was very moderate and modest. He was affable in conversation with strangers and very pleasant to the members of his household, though with a certain gravity. He was so strict in matters of religion that for fasting and saying prayers he might have been taken for a member of a religious order. He was so great an enemy of swearing and blasphemy that I give my word I never heard him utter any other oath than, "By Saint Ferdinand!" And when he grew very angry with someone, his rebuke was to say, "God take you," for doing or saying that. If he had to write anything, he always began by writing these words, "A Jesus cum Maria sit nobis in via," and so fine was his hand that he might have earned his bread by that skill alone. Leaving his other personal traits and customs for mention at the proper time, let us speak of the sciences to which he most devoted himself. He learned his letters at a tender age and studied enough at the University of Pavia to understand the geographers, of whose teaching he was very fond. For this reason he also gave himself to the study of astronomy and geometry, since those sciences are so closely related that one depends upon the other. And because Ptolemy in the beginning of his geography says that one cannot be a good geographer unless one knows how to draw too, he learned a drawing in order to be able to show the position of countries and form geographic bodies, plain and round. Chapter 4. Of the activities of the admiral before he came to Spain. Having gained some knowledge of those sciences, the admiral began to follow the sea, making several voyages east and west, My knowledge of these voyages, and of many other matters touching his early days, is imperfect, for he died before I made so bold as to ask him about such things, or to speak more truly. At the time, such ideas were farthest from my boyish mind, but in a letter that he sent in 1501 to the most serene Catholic sovereigns, to whom he would not have dared write aught but the truth, he wrote the following words: "Very high kings, from a very young age, I began to follow the sea, and have continued to do so to this day. This art of navigation incites those who pursue it to inquire into the secrets of this world. I have passed more than 40 years in this business, and have traveled to every place where there is navigation. Up to the present time, I have had dealings and conversation with learned men, priests and laymen, Latins and Greeks, Jews and Moors, and many others of other sects. I found our Lord very favorable to this my desire, and to further it, he granted me the gift of knowledge. He made me skilled in seamanship, equipped me abundantly with the sciences of astronomy, geometry, and arithmetic, and taught my mind and hand to draw this sphere, and upon it the cities, rivers, mountains, islands, and ports, each in its proper place. During this time I have made it my business to read all that has been written on geography, history, philosophy, and other sciences. Thus our Lord revealed to me that it was feasible to sail from here to the Indies, and placed in me a burning desire to carry out this plan. Filled with this fire, I came to your highnesses. All who knew of my enterprise rejected it with laughter and mockery. They would not heed the arguments I set forth or the authorities I cited. Only your highnesses had faith and confidence in me." In another letter which he wrote to Catholic sovereigns from Hispaniola in January 1495, relating the variations and errors which are commonly found in pilots' sailing directions and charts, he says, "It happened to me that King René, whom God has taken, sent me to Tunis to capture the galleass Fernandina, and when I was off the island of San Pietro near Sardinia, a vessel informed me there were 2 ships in a carrack with the said galleass, which frightened my people, and they resolved to go no further but to return to Marseille to pick up another ship and more men. I, seeing that I could do nothing against their wills without some ruse, agreed to their demand, and changing the point of the compass, made sail at nightfall, and at sunrise the next day we found ourselves off Cape Carthage, while all aboard were certain we were bound for Marseille." Likewise, in a memorial or note that he wrote to prove that the 5 zones are navigable, demonstrating this with the experience of his voyages, he says, "In the month of February, 1477, I sailed 100 leagues beyond the island of Tile, whose northern part is in latitude 73 degrees north, and not 63 degrees as some affirm. Nor does it lie upon the meridian where Ptolemy says the west begins, but much farther west, and to this island, which is as big as England, the English come with their wares, especially from Bristol. When I was there, the sea was not frozen, but the tides were so great that in some places they rose 26 fathoms, and fell as much in depth. The Thule of which Ptolemy speaks does in fact lie where the Admiral says it does. Nowadays it is called Frisland. Farther on, seeking to prove that the equator is habitable, he says, "I visited the fortress of Sao Jorge da Mina, which belongs to the Portuguese king and lies below the equator, and I can testify that it is not uninhabitable, as some would have it." And in the book of his first voyage, he says that he saw some sirens on the coast of Malagueta, but they did not resemble women as much as they are said to. Elsewhere, he says, "Often in sailing from Lisbon to Guinea, I determined by careful calculation that the degree corresponds to 56 2/3 terrestrial miles." Further on, he says that in Chios, an island of the Greek archipelago, he saw mastic drawn from some trees. In another place, he writes, "For 23 years have I followed the sea without leaving it for any considerable space of time. I have seen all of the east and all of the west," by which he means that he had sailed northward, that is, to England, "and I have sailed to Guinea, but nowhere have I seen such good harbors as those in the Indies." Further on, he says that he took to the sea at the age of 14 and followed it ever after. In the book of the second voyage, he writes, "It happened to me while in command of 2 ships, but I left one in Porto Santo for repairs which took only a day, yet I arrived in Lisbon 8 days before that ship, because I had a gale from the southwest, while she had only a weak wind from the northeast, which is contrary. From these examples and citations, we may judge how experienced he was in navigation and how many lands and places he had visited before he gave himself up to the enterprise of his discovery. Chapter 5 of the Admiral's coming to Spain and of what happened to him in Portugal, which was the cause of his discovery of the Indies. The first cause of the Admiral's coming to Spain and devoting himself to the sea was a renowned man of his name and family called Colombo, who won great fame on the sea because he warred so fiercely against infidels and the enemies of his country that his name was used to frighten children in their cradles. He must have been a formidable person indeed, because on one occasion he captured 4 large Venetian galleys of such great size and armament that they had to be seen to be believed. He was called Colombo the Younger, to distinguish him from another Colombo who in his time also won fame on the sea. Marcus Antonius Sabellicus, the levy of our age, writes in the 8th book of the 10th decade of his work that about the time Maximilian, son of the Emperor Frederick III, was elected king of the Romans, Hieronymo Donato was sent as ambassador from Venice to Portugal to thank King João II for having clothed and relieved the people on these great galleys, which were returning from Flanders when they were met and defeated near Lisbon by Colombo the Younger, that famous corsair who robbed the ship's people and turned them ashore. The authority of such a serious scholar as Sabellicus reveals the bias of Giustiniani, who made no mention of this affair in his history in order to conceal the fact that the Colombos were not so obscure a family as he would have them to be. And if he kept silent from ignorance, he is still blamable for having omitted from the history of his country a victory so notable that even the enemies of Genoa mention it. For a hostile historian assigns enough importance to this affair to say that on account of it, ambassadors were sent to the Portuguese king. This author, Sabellicus, a little later in the same 8th book, though under less obligation than Giustiniani to inform himself about the Admiral's discovery, tells of it without bringing in those 12 lies of Giustiniani's. I return to my main theme. While the Admiral was sailing in the company of the said Colombo the Younger, which he did for a long time, it was learned that those 4 great Venetian galleys aforesaid were returning from Flanders. Accordingly, Colombo went out to meet those ships, and found them between Lisbon and Cape St. Vincent, which is in Portugal. Here they came to blows, fighting with great fury and approaching each other until the ships grappled and the men crossed from boat to boat, killing and wounding each other without mercy, using not only hand arms but also firepots and other devices. After they had fought from morning to the hour of vespers, which many dead and wounded on both sides, fire spread from the Admiral's ship to a great Venetian galley, as the 2 ships were grappled tight with hooks and iron chains, which sailors used for this purpose, and on both sides there was much confusion and fear of the flames. Neither side could check the fire. It spread so swiftly that soon there was no remedy for those aboard save to leap in the water and die in this manner rather than suffer the torture of the fire. But the Admiral, being an excellent swimmer, and seeing land only a little more than 2 leagues away, seized an oar which fate offered him, and on which he could rest at times, and so it pleased God, who was preserving him for greater things, to give him the strength to reach the shore. However, he was so fatigued by his experience that it took him many days to recover. Finding himself near Lisbon, and knowing that many of his Genoese countrymen lived in that city, he went there as soon as he could. When they learned who he was, they gave him such a warm welcome that he made his home in that city and married there. As he behaved very honorably and was a man of handsome presence and one who never turned from the path of honesty, a lady named Dona Felipa Moniz, of noble birth and superior of the convent of the saints, where the Admiral used to attend Mass, had such conversation and friendship with him that she became his wife. His father-in-law, Pedro Moniz Perestrero, being dead, they went to live with his widow, who, observing the Admiral's great interest in geography, told him the said Perestrero, her husband, had been a notable seafarer, and she told of how he and 2 other captains had gone with license from the King of Portugal to discover new lands, agreeing to divide all they discovered into 3 parts, and cast lots for the share that should fall to each. Sailing to the southwest, they discovered the islands of Madeira and Porto Santo. Since the island of Madeira was the larger of the 2, they made it 2 parts of it, the third being the island of Porto Santo, which fell to the share of the Admiral's father-in-law Perestreo, who governed it till his death. Seeing that her stories of these voyages gave the Admiral much pleasure, she gave him the writings and sea charts left by her husband. These things excited the admiral still more, and he informed himself of the other voyages and navigations that the Portuguese were then making to Mina and down the coast of Guinea, and greatly enjoyed speaking with the men who sailed in those regions. To tell the truth, I do not know if it was during this marriage that the admiral went to Mina or Guinea, but it seems reasonable that he did so. Be that as it may, one thing leading to another, and starting a train of thought, the admiral, while in Portugal, began to speculate that if the Portuguese could sail so far south, it should be possible to sail as far westward, and that it was logical to expect to find land in that direction. To obtain confirmation on this point, he turned anew to study the writers on geography with whose work he was already familiar, and to consider the astronomical arguments that might support his design. Consequently, he noted down any helpful hints that sailors or other persons might drop. He made such good use of all these things that he grew convinced beyond the shadow of a doubt that to the west of the Canary and Cape Verde Islands lay many lands which could be reached and discovered. To show on what weak foundations he raised the vast structure of his project, and in order to satisfy the many persons who wished to know the exact reasons that led him to believe in the existence of these lands and dare launch his enterprise, I shall relate what I have found on this subject in his writings. Chapter 6 of the Admiral's principal reason for believing that he could discover the Indies. Turning to the reasons which persuaded the Admiral to undertake the discovery of the Indies, I say there were three, namely, natural reasons, the authority of writers, and the testimony of sailors. With respect to the first, the natural reasons, he believed that since all the water and land in the world form a sphere, it would be possible to go around it from east to west until men stood feet to feet, one against the other at opposite ends of the earth. In the second place, he assumed and knew on the authority of approved writers that a large part of the sphere had already been navigated, and that there remained to be discovered only the space which extended from the eastern end of India, known to Ptolemy and Marinus, eastward to the Cape Verde and Azore Islands, the westernmost land discovered up to that time. Thirdly, he believed that this space between the eastern end, known to Marinus, and the said Cape Verde Islands could not be more than the third part of the great circle of the sphere, because Marinus had already described in the east 15 of the 24 astronomical BK hours or parts into which the world is divided. Therefore, to reach the Cape Verdes barely required 8 more hours, since even Marinus did not begin his description very far to the west. In the fourth place, he noted that Marinus, having assigned in his geography 15 hours, or parts of the sphere to the east, had not yet come to the end of the eastern lands, which made it reasonable to assume that that end lay much farther beyond, and the farther eastward it extended, the closer must it be to the Cape Verdes. Now, if the intervening space were sea, it would be an easy matter to navigate it in a few days, and if it were land, the quicker could it be discovered from the west, because it would be closer to the Cape Verdes. He found support for this reasoning in what Strabo says in Book 15 of his Geography, that no army ever reached the eastern bounds of India, which Ctesias states to be as large as all the rest of Asia. Onscritus affirms that India is the third part of this sphere, and Nerchus says that to cross India requires 4 months of travel over flat ground, while Pliny asserts in chapter 17 of Book 6 that it is the third part of the earth. Wherefore the admiral concluded that India's great size would place it closer to Spain on the west. The fifth argument, which gave the greatest support to the view that this space was small, was the opinion of Alfragan and his followers, who assigned a much smaller size to the earth than all the other writers and geographers, calculating a degree to be only 56 2/3 miles, whence the admiral inferred that since the whole sphere was small, of necessity that space of the third part which Marinus left as unknown had to be small and therefore could be navigated in less time. From this he also inferred that since the eastern end of India was not yet known, that end must be the one which is close to us in the west. Therefore any lands that he should discover might be called the Indies. Here one plainly sees how wrong was a certain Master Rodrigo, formerly Archdeacon of Reina and Seville, and some others who join him in censuring the admiral for naming these lands the Indies, which they are not. The admiral called them the Indies not because they had been seen or discovered by others, but because they were the eastern part of India, beyond the Ganges, to which no geographer had ever set bounds on the east, or made it border on any other country eastward, but only upon the ocean, and because these lands were the unknown eastern part of India, and had no name of their own. He named them after the nearest adjoining land, calling them the West Indies. He had the more reason for doing this because he knew all men had heard of the great fame and wealth of India. And by using that name, he hoped to arouse the interest of the Catholic sovereigns who were doubtful of his enterprise, telling them that he was going to discover the Indies by way of the West. And he desired the support of the rulers of Castile for this plan above that of any other Christian king. Chapter 7. The second reason that encouraged the admiral to seek to discover the Indies. The second reason that inspired the admiral to launch his enterprise and helped justify his giving the name Indies to the lands which he discovered was the authority of many learned men who said that one could sail westward from the western end of Africa and Spain to the eastern end of India, and that no great sea lay between. Aristotle affirms this in the conclusion of the second book on the heavens, observing that from the Indies to Cadiz is but a few days' sailing. This is confirmed by Averroes in his gloss on this point. Seneca, in the first book of his Natural Questions, declaring the wisdom that may be acquired in this life to be as nothing by comparison with what can be gained in the next, says that with a fair wind a ship could sail from the end of Spain to the Indies in a few days. If, as some believe, this Seneca wrote the tragedies attributed to him, we may say that it was apropos of this that he wrote in the chorus of his tragedy, Medea.
Venient annis secula sere, quibus oceanos, vincula rerum loxe, et ingens, patria tellus, tifisque novos, detegat orbas, nec sit terris, ultima, tule.
This means, there will come a time in the later years when ocean shall loosen the bonds by which we have been confined, when an immense land shall be revealed, and Typhus shall disclose new worlds, and Thule will no longer be the most remote of countries. Now it is considered certain that this prophecy was fulfilled in the person of the admiral. Strabo, in the first book of his Geography, says that the ocean surrounds the whole earth, and that it bathes India in the east, and Spain and Mauritania in the west. He adds that if it were not for the magnitude of the Atlantic, one could sail from one place to the other along the same parallel. He repeats this statement in the second book. Pliny, in the second book of his Natural History, chapter 3, also says that the ocean surrounds the whole earth, and that its length from east to west is that from India to Cadiz. The same author, in chapter 31 of book 6, and Solinus, in chapter 68 of his Collection of Memorable Things, says that from the Gorgonas Islands, which are believed to be the Cape of Verdes, it is 40 days sailing across the Atlantic to the Hesperides Islands, which the admiral doubted not were the Indies. Marco Polo, a Venetian, and John Mandeville tell in their travel accounts that they journeyed far beyond the eastern lands described by Ptolemy and Marinus. They do not speak of the western sea, but from their description of the east, it could be argued that India neighbors on Africa and Spain. Pierre d'Ailly, in chapter 8, concerning the size of the habitable earth of his treatise concerning the form of the world, and Julius Capitolinus, in concerning the habitable places, and many other treatises, say that India and Spain are near each other in the west. In chapter 19 of his Geography, Julius Capitolinus says, according to the philosophers and to Pliny, the ocean which lies between Spain and Africa on the west, and India on the east, is not of very great extent, and doubtless could be navigated in a few days with a fair wind. Therefore the beginnings of India in the east cannot be very far from the end of Africa in the west. The authority of this writer and others like him did more than all else to convince the admiral that his idea was sound. One Master Paolo, physician to Master Domenico, a Florentine and contemporary of the admiral's, also played a large part in encouraging him to undertake his voyage. This Master Paolo was a friend of Fernão Martins, a canon of Lisbon, and they corresponded with each other concerning the voyages being made to Guinea in the time of King Afonso of Portugal, and the possibility of similar voyages to the western regions. The correspondence came to the notice of the admiral, who was very curious about such matters, and he hastened to write Master Paolo through the agency of Lorenzo Gherardi, a Florentine residing in Lisbon, sending him a small sphere on which he showed his design. Master Paolo replied in a letter written in Latin, which translated into the vernacular reads as follows. Chapter 8. The Letters of Paolo, a physician of Florence, to the Admiral concerning the discovery of the Indies. Paolo, the physician to Christopher Columbus. Greetings. I perceive your noble and grand desire to go to the places where the spices grow, and in reply to your letter, I send you a copy of another letter, which some time since I sent to a friend of mine, a gentleman of the household of the most serene king of Portugal before the wars of Castile, in reply to another which, by command of his highness, he wrote me on this subject. And I send you another sea chart like the one I sent him, that your demands may be satisfied. A copy of that letter of mine follows. Paolo the physician, to Fernando Martins, canon of Lisbon. Greetings. I was glad to hear of your intimacy and friendship with your most serene and magnificent king. I have often before spoken of a sea route from here to the Indies where the spices grow, a route shorter than the one which you are pursuing by way of Guinea. You tell me that His Highness desires from me some statement or demonstration that would make it easier to understand and take that route. I could do this by using a sphere shaped like the Earth, but I decided that it would be easier and make the point clear if I showed that route by means of a sea chart. I therefore send His Majesty a chart drawn by my own hand, upon which is laid out the western coast, from Ireland on the north to the end of Guinea, and the islands which lie on that route, in front of which, directly to the west, is shown the beginning of the Indies, with the islands and places at which you are bound to arrive, and how far from the Arctic Pole or the equator you ought to keep away, and how much space or how many leagues intervene before you reach those places most fertile in all sorts of spices, jewels, and precious stones. Do not marvel at my calling west the regions where the spices grow, although they are commonly called east, because whoever sails westward will always find those lands in the west, while one who goes overland to the east will always find the same lands in the east. The straight lines drawn lengthwise on this map show the distance from east to west. The transverse lines indicate distance from north to south. I have also drawn on the map various places in India to which one could go in case of a storm or contrary winds, or some other mishap. And that you may be as well informed about all those regions as you desire to be, you must know that none but merchants live and trade in all those islands. There is as great a number of ships and mariners with their merchandise here as in all the rest of the world, especially in a very noble port called Zayaton, where every year they load and unload 100 large ships laden with pepper, besides many other ships loaded with other spices. This country is very populous, with a multitude of provinces and kingdoms and cities without number, under the rule of a prince who is called the Great Khan, which name in our speech signifies King of Kings, who resides most of the time in the province of Cathay. His predecessors greatly desired to have friendship and dealings with the Christians, and about 200 years ago they sent ambassadors to the Pope, asking for many learned men and teachers to instruct them in our faith. But these ambassadors, encountering obstacles on the way, turned back without reaching Rome. In the time of Pope Eugenius, there came to him an ambassador who told of their great feeling of friendship for the Christians, and I had a long talk with him about many things, about the great size of their royal palaces and the marvelous length and breadth of their rivers, and the multitude of cities in their lands, so that on one river alone there are 200 cities, with marble bridges very long and wide, adorned with many columns. This country is as rich as any that has ever been found. Not only could it yield great gain and many costly things, but from it may also be had gold and silver and precious stones, and all sorts of spices in great quantity, which at present are not carried to our countries. And it is true that many learned men, philosophers, and astronomers, and many other men skilled in all the arts, govern this great province and conduct its wars. From the city of Lisbon due west, there are 26 spaces marked on the map, each of which contains 250 miles as far as the very great and noble city of Quinsay. This city is about 100 miles in circumference, which is equal to 35 leagues, and has 10 marble bridges. Marvelous things are told about its great buildings, its arts, and its revenues. That city lies in the province of Mangai, near the province of Cathay, in which the king resides the greater part of the time, and from the island of Antilla, which you call the island of the seven cities, to the very noble island of Chipango. There are 10 spaces, which make it 2,500 miles, that is 225 leagues. This land is most rich in gold, pearls, and precious stones, and the temples and royal palaces are covered with solid gold. But because the way is not known, all these things are hidden and covered, though one can travel thither with all security. Many other things could I say, but since I have already told them to you by word of mouth, and you are a man of good judgment, I know there remains nothing for me to explain. I have tried to satisfy your demands as well as the pressure of time, and my work is permitted, and I remain ready to serve His Highness and answer his questions at greater length if he should order me to do so, done in the city of Florence, June 25th, 1474. Master Paolo afterwards wrote the admiral another letter, which read as follows. Paolo the physician to Christopher Columbus, greetings. I have received your letters together with the things you sent me, and took great pleasure in them. I perceive your grand and noble desire to sail from west to east by the route indicated on the map I sent you, a route which would appear still more plainly upon a sphere. I am much pleased to see that I have been well understood, and that the voyage has become not only possible, but certain, fraught with inestimable honor and gain and most lofty fame among Christians. But you cannot grasp all that it means without actual experience, or without such accurate and copious information as I have had from eminent learned men who have come from those places to the Roman court, and from merchants who have traded a long time in those parts and speak with great authority on such matters. When that voyage shall be made, it will be a voyage to powerful kingdoms and noble cities, and rich provinces abounding in all sorts of things that we greatly need, including all manner of spices and jewels in great abundance. It will also be a voyage to kings and princes who are very eager to have friendly dealings and speech with the Christians of our countries. Because many of them are Christians, they are also very eager to know and speak with the learned men of our lands concerning religion and all other branches of knowledge, because of the much they have heard of the empires and governments of these parts. For these reasons and many others that might be mentioned, I do not wonder that you, who are of great courage, and the whole Portuguese nation, which has always distinguished itself in all great enterprises, are now inflamed with desire to undertake this voyage. This letter, as was said before, filled the admiral with even greater zeal for discovery, though its writer was mistaken in his belief that the first lands to which one would come would be Cathay and the empire of the great Khan, and in the other things that he wrote, for experience has shown that the distance from our Indies to those lands is much greater than the distance from here to our Indies. Chapter 9. The third reason and sign that gave the admiral some encouragement to discover the Indies. The admiral's third and last motive for seeking the Indies was his hope of finding before he arrived there some island or land of great importance whence he might the better pursue his main design. He found support for this hope in the authority of many learned men and philosophers who were certain that the land area of the globe was greater than that of the water. This being so, he argued that between the end of Spain and the known end of India, there must be many other islands and lands, as experience has since shown to be true. He believed this all the more because he was impressed by the many fables and stories which he heard from various persons and sailors who traded to the western islands and seas of the Azores and Madeira. Since these stories served his design, he was careful to file them away in his memory. I shall tell them here in order to satisfy those who take delight in such curiosities. A pilot of the Portuguese king, Martin Vicente by name, told him that on one occasion, finding himself 450 leagues west of Cape St. Vincent, he fished out of the sea a piece of wood, ingeniously carved, but not with iron. For this reason, and because for many days the winds had blown from the west, he concluded this wood came from some islands to the west. Pedro Correa, who was married to a sister of the admiral's wife, told him that on the island of Porto Santo he had seen another piece of wood brought by the same wind, carved as well as the aforementioned one, and that canes had also drifted in, so thick that one joint held into 9 decanters of wine. He said that in conversation with the Portuguese king, he had told him the same thing and had shown him the canes. Since such canes do not grow anywhere on our lands, he was sure that the wind had blown them from some neighboring islands, or perhaps from India. Ptolemy, in the first book of his Geography, chapter 17, writes that such canes are found in the eastern parts of the Indies. Some persons in the Azores also told him that after the wind had blown for a long time from the west, the sea cast on the shores of those islands, especially of Graciosa and Fayal, pine trees that do not grow on those islands or anywhere in that region. On the island of Flores, which is one of the Azores, the sea flung ashore 2 dead bodies with broad faces and different in appearance from the Christians. Off Cape Verga and elsewhere in that region, there once were seen covered boats or canoes, which were believed to have been crossing from one island to another when a storm drove them off their course. In addition to these signs, which seem rather plausible, some claim to have seen certain islands. Among them was one Antonio Leme, a married man of the island of Madeira, who said that once while sailing very far to the west, he had seen 3 islands. The admiral put no stock in these stories, because from the accounts of these men, he knew they had not sailed even 100 leagues to the west and had taken some reefs for islands. Or these men may have seen some of those floating islands which Pliny also mentions in chapter 97 of the second book of his Natural History, saying that in the northern regions, the sea ate away pieces of land on which grow trees with very thick roots, and that these pieces are carried along on the water as if they were rafts or little islands. Seneca, attempting to explain the nature of these islands, says in the third book of his Natural Questions that they are composed of stone so spongy and light that the Indian islands formed from it float on the water. Therefore, the admiral supposed that even if Antonio Leme had seen some island, it must have been one of that kind. The islands called St. Brendan, of which so many marvels are told, were probably of the same nature. One finds mention of still others that lie much farther north. In those regions there are other islands that burn perpetually. Juventius Fortunatus tells of two other floating islands supposed to lie to the west and farther south than the Cape Verdes. Cases of this kind may explain why many people on the islands of Faro, Gomera, and the Azores assured the admiral that every year they saw some islands to the west, and many persons of worth swore it was so. The admiral also tells that in 1484, an inhabitant of the island of Madeira came to Portugal to ask the king for a caravel in order to discover some land which he swore he saw every year, and always in the same situation. His story agreed with that of others who claimed to have seen it from an island of the Azores. On the basis of such stories, the charts and maps of ancient days showed certain islands in that region. Aristotle, in his book on marvelous things, reports a story that some Carthaginian merchants sailed over the Atlantic to a very fertile island, as I shall presently relate in more detail. This island some Portuguese showed on their charts under the name of Antillia, but in a different situation from Aristotle, though none placed it more than 200 leagues due west of the Canaries and the Azores. And they hold it for certain that this is the island of the 7 cities, settled by the Portuguese at the time the Moors conquered Spain from King Rodrigo, that is, in the year AD 714. They say that at that time 7 bishops embarked from Spain and came with their ships and people to this island, where each founded a city, and in order that their people might give up all thought of returning to Spain, they burned their ships, riggings, and all else needed for navigation. Some Portuguese who speculated about this island conjectured that many of their nation had gone thither, but were never able to return. In particular, they say that in the time of the Infante Dom Henrique of Portugal, there arrived at this island of Antillia a Portuguese ship, driven there by a storm. After coming ashore, the ship's people were conducted by the inhabitants of the island to their church to see if the visitors were Christians and observe the rites of the Catholic religion. Satisfied that they were Christians, the islanders prayed the ship's people not to leave before the return of their absent lord, whom they would immediately notify of the ship's arrival. They also said that their lord would do great honor to the visitors and give them many presents. But the ship's master and the sailors feared to be detained, reasoning that because their people did not wish to be known abroad, they might burn their ship. So they left for Portugal with their news, expecting to be rewarded by the Infante, who instead rebuked them severely and ordered them to return immediately to the island. But the master took fright and escaped from Portugal with his ship and crew. It is said that while the sailors were in the church on that island, the ship's boys gathered sand for the firebox and found that it was 1/3 fine gold. One Diogo de Tive also went in search of that island. His pilot, Pedro de Velasco, by name a native of Palos de Moguer, told the admiral in Santa Maria de la Rábida that they had departed from Fayal and sailed more than 150 leagues to the southwest. On their return, they discovered the island of Flores, to which they were guided by the many birds they saw flying in that direction. As they knew them to be land and not marine birds, they decided they must be flying to some resting place. Then they steered northeast until they reached Cape Clear at the western end of Ireland. Although they encountered very high westerly winds in this region, the sea remained calm. They decided this must be due to the fact that the sea was sheltered by some land on the west, but since it was already August and they feared the onset of winter, they gave up the search for that island. This happened 40 years before the discovery of our Indies. This story was confirmed to the admiral by a one-eyed sailor in the port of Santa Maria, who told him that on a voyage he had made to Ireland, he saw that land, which at that time he supposed to be a part of Tartary, that it turned westward. It must have been what is now called the land of Cod, and that foul weather prevented them from approaching it. The admiral says that this account agrees with one given him by Pedro de Velasco, a Galician, who told him in the city of Murcia in Castile that on a voyage to Ireland they sailed so far northwest that they saw land to the west of Ireland. This land, the admiral thought, was the same that a certain Fernão Dolmo tried to discover. I relate this just as I found it told in my father's writings, that it may be known how from small matters some draw substance for great deeds. Gonzalo Fernandez de Ovida tells in his History of the Indies that the admiral had a map on which the Indies were shown by the man who had first discovered them. What actually happened was this. A Portuguese named Vicente Diaz, a citizen of the town of Tavira, going from Guinea to the island of Terceira, having left the island of Madeira on his east, saw or imagined that he saw an island. On arrival at Terceira, he told this to a Genoese merchant named Luca de Casana, a friend of his who was very rich, and urged him to outfit a ship for the conquest of that land. The Genoese agreed and obtained permission from the Portuguese king to do this. Then he wrote his brother Francesco de Casana, who lived in Seville, praying him to outfit a ship with all speed for the use of that pilot. But his brother jeered at the project, whereupon Luca de Casana himself outfitted a ship on the island of Terceira. The pilot went 3 or 4 times in search of the island, sailing as far as 120 to 130 leagues from land, but all in vain, for he never found the island. However, neither he nor his comrade abandoned the enterprise until their deaths, because they always hoped to find the island again. The aforesaid Francesco told me he had known 2 sons of the captain who discovered the island of Terceira named Miguel and Gaspar Corteriel, who at various times tried to discover that land. Finally, in 1503, they perished in the attempt, one after the other. None knows how or where. Francesco said this affair was known of to many. Chapter 10, in which is shown the falsity of the claim that the Spaniards once before had possession of the Indies, as Gonzalo de Ovida attempts to prove in his history. If the stories that persons who are almost our contemporaries tell of all these islands and lands are idle fancies and imaginings, what shall we say of the tall tales that Gonzalo Fernandez de Ovida spins in the 3rd chapter of his Historia Natural de las Indias? He claims to have proved beyond question that there was an earlier discoverer of the sea route to the Indies, and that the Spaniards once before had possession of those lands, citing as proof what Aristotle says of the island of Atlantis in Sebosus of the Hesperides. His claims are so irrational and baseless in the judgment of certain authors whose works I have carefully examined that I would gladly pass them by in silence to avoid criticizing anyone and boring my readers, were it not that some persons assign great value and importance to these fantasies to the prejudice of the honor and glory of the admiral. Moreover, having sought to show accurately the signs and authorities that inspired him to launch his enterprise, I should be remiss in my duty to one to whom I owe so much if I left standing such a great lie. To make plain Ovido's error, I shall first quote what Aristotle has to say about this in the collection of his propositions, made by Fray Teofilo de Ferraris, who in the book Concerning the Wonders of Nature has a chapter that contains the following. It is told that in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the columns of Hercules, in ancient times, some Carthaginian merchants found an island that had never been inhabited by men, but only by savage beasts. It was thickly wooded, with many navigable rivers, and abounded in all that nature produces. But it was many days' sail from the mainland. On their arrival, finding the island good, with a fertile soil and a temperate climate, these Carthaginian merchants settled there. But the Carthaginian Senate, angered by the news of their action, publicly decreed that henceforth none might visit that island, and ordered that those who had first gone there should be put to death, because it was feared that knowledge and possession of that island might be gained by some more powerful empire that would convert it into a threat to the liberties of Carthage. Having carefully translated this source, I shall explain my reasons for saying that Ovida's claim that this island was either Hispaniola or Cuba is without foundation. In the first place, since Ovido knew no Latin, he had to use a version that someone else made for him, and that person evidently was not very skilled in translation, since he altered the Latin text at many points. Perhaps these changes led Ovido astray and made him think the book spoke of some islands of the Indies. The Latin text does not say that those mariners sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar, as Ovida has it, nor is it stated that the island was large and its trees large, but simply that it was thickly wooded. Nor were the rivers said to be marvelous and the island fertile. Nor does it say that it was farther from Africa than from Europe, but only that it was far from the mainland. Nor does it state that the towns were founded there, since little of that sort could be done by the merchants who chanced to arrive there. Nor is it written that the island was very famous, but only that the Carthaginian Senate feared its fame might spread to other nations. As a result of the ignorance of the person who translated that source for him, Ovid formed a very imperfect conception of the matter. And if he should argue that Aristotle's text differs from the friar's account, which was only a summary of what Aristotle wrote, I would ask Ovid who made him a judge to distribute kingdoms at his pleasure and to rob of his honor one who had so well earned it. I would also tell him he ought not be content to use a summary in a friar's memorandum book, but should go directly to his source in the works of Aristotle. Besides, he was badly informed in this case, for whereas in all his other books, Teofilo gives only the substance of what Aristotle said, in this book, concerning the wonders of nature, he states at the outset that he is citing the original text word for word, and it cannot be claimed that there is more or less in Aristotle than what he himself wrote. I may add that Antonio Beccaria of Verona, who translated the book from Greek to Latin, and whose version was used by Teofilo, made more than 4 changes from the Greek text, as anyone who looks into it can see for himself. Again, even if Aristotle had written this just as Teofilo renders it, Aristotle cites no authority but uses the word "fortre," it is told, by which he meant that what he wrote about this island was doubtful and had no supporting evidence. He also writes about it as something that had happened a long time ago, saying it is told that in ancient times an island was found. To this, one could apply the proverb that long journeys and big lies go together, a proverb all the more applicable to a story containing statements that fly in the face of common sense, like the one in which Ovid says that the island abounded in everything but had always been uninhabited. A most unlikely statement, for only cultivation makes land productive, and where no men live, nothing useful will grow of itself, and even domesticated plants turn wild and sterile. Nor is it likely that the Carthaginians would have been displeased because their people had found such an island, nor that they would have slain its discoverers. For if it was as far from Carthage as are the Indies, they had no reason to fear an attack by its inhabitants. But perhaps Ovid would say not only that the Spaniards once possessed those islands, but also that the Carthaginians were prophets, whose predictions and fears have been fulfilled in our time through the taking of Tunis, or Carthage, by the Emperor Charles V with the aid of treasure obtained from the Indies. He would doubtless have written this too, to ingratiate himself and gain more favors of the kind he gained by writing such fantasies, but it was too late. His book had already been published. Every person of sound judgment will understand how ridiculous it is to say that knowledge of that island was lost, because the Carthaginians abandoned it for fear that others would wrest it from them and later use it to attack their city. Surely they had greater reason to fear Sicily and Sardinia, only 2 days' sail from their city, than Hispaniola, a third part of the world away. To the argument that they may have feared that the riches of that land would make their enemies so powerful that they might eventually inflict some injury upon them, I reply they would have had a greater hope of being able to repel and defeat the aggressor if they had retained possession of that wealth. While abandoning the island, they would have made of its discovery a gift to others, thus giving rise to the very evil they feared. Surely they would have rather fortified it and protected its approaches, as we know they did in similar cases. Thus, having discovered the islands then called the Cassiterides, which we call the Azores, they kept its navigation secret for a long time on account of the tin they obtained from there, as Strabo relates in the conclusion to the 3rd book of his Geography. I therefore conclude that even if Aristotle actually wrote this fable, he may have been referring to the navigation to the Azores, and I believe that Ovid is led astray by faulty information, by the frailty of old age, or by blind prejudice when he argues that the story refers to the Indies that we possess today and not to the Azores, or one of them. And if I am told that this cannot be, because it was not the Carthaginians who held the Azores but the Phoenicians who traded with Cadiz, I reply that since the Carthaginians came from Phoenicia with Queen Dido, they were called Phoenicians at that time, just as today we call Spaniards those Christians who are born and bred in the Indies. And if they come back at me that Aristotle says about this island that it contained many navigable rivers such as are found in Cuba and Hispaniola, but not in the Azores, I reply that if we are going to take note of that statement, we must also note that he adds that this island contained many savage animals, which are found neither in Cuba nor Hispaniola. And in dealing with a matter of such antiquity, Aristotle may well have erred in this particular, as is likely to happen in the telling of such very remote and obscure events. Now, in point of fact, neither Cuba nor Hispaniola has navigable rivers such as Aristotle speaks of. True, any ship could enter the larger rivers of those islands, but could not sail up them comfortably. Besides, even if the text were really Aristotle's, the word navigandum, navigable, might have been a mistake for potandum, drinkable, which fits better in the context since Aristotle was praising the islands for the abundance of its potable water and edible fruits. This could well be said of the Azores, and with greater reason, for neither Cuba nor Hispaniola is so situated that the Carthaginians could have been blown there through being near or through mischance. And if the men who sailed with the admiral with the single aim of seeking the Indies found the voyage so long that they wanted to turn back, how much longer must it have seemed to men who had no intention of making such a prolonged voyage, and would gladly have returned to their homeland whenever the weather permitted? And whoever heard of a storm of such duration and force that it could blow a ship from Cadiz to Hispaniola? Nor is it credible that these merchants wanted to remain away from Spain or Carthage any longer than foul weather obliged them to, especially since voyages were not undertaken so lightly or made so easily then as now. That is why in those days, very short cruises appeared to be major enterprises, as witnessed the voyage made by Jason from Greece to Colchis, and that of Ulysses in the Mediterranean, both of which took so many years and gained those heroes such renown that the most eminent poets sang their praises, all because of their small experience in navigation. Only in our time have matters so improved that some have dared to circumnavigate the globe, scorning the proverb that says, "When Cape Nun heaves into sight, turn back, me lad, or else good night." This Cape Nun is a promontory on the Barbary coast, not very far from the Canaries. Besides, it is plainly a mistake to suppose that the island to which the merchants were driven could have been Cuba or Hispaniola, because we know for certain that it is almost impossible to approach those islands without first coming to many other islands that surround them on all sides. But if in spite of everything some should still insist that that land or island was not one of the Azores as I have suggested, one could top one lie with another by saying that that land was the island mentioned by Seneca in the 6th book of his Natural Questions, where he quotes Thucydides as saying that during the Peloponnesian War, the whole island of Atlantis, or the greater part of it, was submerged. Plato also tells of this in his Timaeus. Having already spoken too much of this fable, let us go on to another chapter, in which Ovidio says that in ancient times the Spaniards had possession of those Indies, basing himself on what Sebosus wrote, that certain islands called the Hesperids were 40 days' sail west of the Gorgonas Islands. From this, Ovidio concludes that those islands must be the Indies, and being called the Hesperides, they must have received that name from the Hesperus, who once ruled over Spain, and consequently that king and the Spaniards must have ruled over those lands. Thus, it appears that Ovidio wishes to draw 3 valid conclusions from a doubtful source, wherein he disagrees with Seneca, who in speaking of these matters in the 6th book of his Natural Questions, observes that it is risky to make any certain and definite statement on the basis of more conjecture. Yet that is just what Ovidio did, for Sebosus spoke only of the Hesperids, indicating where they lay, but not stating that they were the Indies or by whom they were named or conquered. As for Ovidio's assertion that Hesperus was a king of Spain, I concede that Sebosus makes that statement, but he says nothing of Hesperus giving his name to Spain or Italy. Ovidio, having noted, like the truthful historian he is, that Sebosus failed him at this point, turned for aid to Hyginus, being careful, however, not to cite book or chapter, thus improving upon his testimony, as the saying goes. For in effect, one cannot find a single passage of Hyginus's in which he says anything of the kind. On the contrary, in the single book of his which has been preserved, entitled Poetic Astronomy, he not only does not say this, but in 3 places, speaking of the Hesperids, he observes Hercules is depicted as preparing to kill the dragon that guarded the Hesperids. Further on, he says that Hercules, having been sent by Eurystheus to seek the golden apples of the Hesperides, went to Prometheus on Mount Caucasus to ask him to show him the way, and this led to the death of the dragon. This story assigns the Hesperides to the east, and Ovidio could just as well say that Hesperus, king of Spain, gave them their name. Farther on, in a chapter on the planets, Hyginus adds that in many stories the planet Venus is called Hesperus because it sets soon after the sun. From all this, we may conclude that if any weight or authority should be assigned to a writer like Hyginus, given to relating the fables of poets, his evidence goes against, rather than in favor of Ovidio, and we may assume that those islands were named Hesperides after that star. And just as the Greeks called Italy Hesperia for that reason, as many writers affirm, so Sebosus named those islands the Hesperides, as I believe, and in seeking to establish the location he used the same speculations and reasoning that convinced the admiral those islands lay in the west. We may thus conclude not only that Ovidio fakes sources in his writings, but also that inadvertently or from a desire to please the person who told him these things, for he certainly did not think them up himself, he inclines to 2 opposed positions whose contradictory character makes plain how wrong he is. For if, as he claims, the Carthaginians found Cuba, or Espanol inhabited only by animals, how could the Spaniards have possessed it a long time before? And how could their king Hesperus have given it his name? Or could it be that some deluge laid it waste and afterward a new Noah returned it to the state in which the admiral discovered it? But I grow weary of this dispute and fear that I have already bored my readers with it. So I will say no more about the matter and continue instead with my history.